tax. It acts as a stabilizing device which protected local government subsequent to 2008 to a much more stable revenue flow than would have otherwise occurred. 3, on the question of regressivity. The seminal study on that was done by Steve Scheffrin at the University of California at Davis. And he said, okay, let's assume a revenue neutral change. We're going to reassess all homeowner property, make it revenue neutral. What his study found out was the lowest income people would get a tax increase, the highest income people would get a tax decrease. So that's the ultimate study of the regressivity, and it's not regressive, and it's more progressive than you would be with an annual reassessment system. On this question of land taxes, taxes on land, this is not appraisal theory, and it's not Section 51 of the Revenue Tax Code. Property is assessed on a unit appraised on a unit appraisal basis. Land and improvements appraised together as a unit. Fixtures is another unit. Personal property is another unit. Then after you appraise land and improvements of fixture, there's an allocation to land and improvements because the Constitution requires that, but it doesn't have to be very accurate. It's just kind of a arbitrary, let's put so much on the land, because it doesn't make any difference as far as what the value in which the taxpayer said. But the appraisal unit under appraisal theory and current law has to be land and improvements together. Finally, and this is, I think, a really important point, particularly considering where this committee was last year. If you do a split roll, what you're going to have is the California-based companies that employ thousands, hundred thousands of people, they're going to get a tax increase. Out-of-state companies selling into California, they're not going to pay any higher tax. Now, last year we heard the rhetoric and the arguments that that was not a good idea. For example, under this split roll proposal, California booksellers would pay more because they'd be reassessed under whatever system. People out of state selling books into California, they would have no reassessment. So the idea that what you did last year, this exactly 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So I think that in protecting the California businesses, the wrong way to do it would be go out and reassess all businesses and cause them to pay much higher taxes. So in conclusion, we think that the present system is working pretty well. It's got countercyclical device, it benefits taxpayers, and any system that's you're going to have to look at the advantages and disadvantages. And the Supreme Court did. Adam Smith said that certainty is much more important than slight variations in tax burden. And so weigh the differences, weigh the advantages, weigh the disadvantages. I think you find that there are a lot more advantages to the system we have now than that system that we would change it to where everybody is reassessed on an annual basis.
Great. Thank you for your testimony. Last, we have Douglas Weil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for committee members. Doug Wheely, founding partner of Foothill Partners in El Dorado Hills. We spent several hours this afternoon talking about commercial property owners and commercial property taxes, and I am here as a commercial property owner. You've been talking about me. I'm a layman. I'm here on my own behalf. I volunteer and give back to the community as the Secretary-Treasurer of California Business Properties Association, but I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not an advocate. I'm just here to give you a glimpse into what my business is like and to respond to some of the things that I've heard said today. By brief introduction, I'm a fourth-generation Californian. I am 35 years in the commercial real estate business here in Northern California after graduating from the business school at Cal, now the Haas Business School, but it wasn't called that then. I acquire and develop and operate properties around Northern California. I do that in partnerships with private and institutional equity funds. I also develop properties for public agencies, including the Washington Township Hospital District in Fremont, the City of Monterey. I'm one of the redevelopment agency developers that no longer does that. My business for the last 10 years has been focused on infill retail and mixed-use properties, and we'll talk a little bit about mixed-use properties because they defy the definition of commercial property. And I think our brand is most well known for the center that we rebuilt in a public partnership with the city of Monterey, the Trader Joe's anchored Uptown Monterey Shopping Center in downtown Monterey. It's the first U.S. Green Building Council LEED certified shopping center in the western United States. And I point that out because in my experience in working with U.S. Green Building Council, I saw something that is relevant to our discussion today. There's a philosophy professor at USC, Dallas Willard, who wrote, presumed familiarity leads to unfamiliarity, and unfamiliarity to contempt, and contempt to ignorance. What I found at USGBC was not ignorant people, but I found people who had absolutely no understanding about my business. I went all the way through the business school at Cal and never heard of the term a triple net lease or any sort of a net lease. My first year as a young broker at Grubb & Ellis, I had to figure out what in the world is a triple net lease. When USGBC wrote their standards for LEED certification of a building, getting into energy and environmental design, it never occurred to them that the occupant of the building was not the person who invested in the building, that the person who bought the air conditioning system, who put the electrical system into the building, wasn't the one that was going to run it. It never occurred to them that there was a disconnect between first cost and operating cost. But the whole shopping center business is built that way. In fact, most industrial real estate and now most office buildings are operated that way, where the expense of operating a commercial property is passed through from the landlord to the tenant. Why is that? Well, in a shopping center business, it's easy to understand, and in a manufacturing plant, it is also. The little boutique is open 8 hours a day, but the grocery store is open 24 hours a day. Why should the boutique pay for the power to run the grocery store 24 hours a day when she's only there a third of that time? So utilities are metered to each space. And each person runs their own systems. They turn on their own lights. They shut them off. And in the same manner, insurance costs are passed through, common area maintenance expenses are passed through, and property taxes are passed through. The hard reality is, and it has been this way since I started in the business in 1976, landlords do not pay taxes. Tenants pay taxes. The only time in which landlords pay taxes is if there's a vacancy and there's nobody there to pay the tax. And there's always a little bit of vacancy. If we're less than 5% vacant, our rents are probably a little too low. So we always are sitting on the same side of the table in a small degree with our tenants. But the hard reality in this discussion is landlords, commercial property owners, do not pay taxes. It gets passed through to the businesses, small and large, who occupy those buildings. I'd like to think we were really creative and great by getting the first LEED certification, but it was just that nobody else would take it on because the whole system wasn't designed that way. Our tax system, our whole conversation today is overlooking the fact that taxes get passed through to the small businesses are there. There are instances like Intel, corporations that own their real estate, but they are in the great minority. Most commercial real estate in the United States is institutionally owned in partnerships or limited liability companies with pension funds and insurance companies and banks backing individual equity and private equity. Most of it is leased. It's not owner-occupied. There's lots of talk today about how to get commercial property owners to pay taxes, but the truth, as we said, is that tenants pay. So whatever is done to change our current tax structure, we might be intending to get to this farmer who's owned land in Silicon Valley since I was a kid and there were no freeways there. I grew up in the Bay Area. But we're really going to get to the operating businesses in those buildings, and that's where the tax bills are going to flow. A shock to the property tax system like that will have unintended consequences that will prove to be ugly. If you think back to 1986 and the Federal Tax Reform Act of 1986, which was intended to drive real estate syndicators out of commercial real estate to put real estate on a sound financial footing, that was a great idea, but it was implemented over a period of about 36 months. In 36 months, it took all the syndicators, those tax-oriented syndicators, out of the business. It took 30% out of the market, away from the market, and it collapsed the S&L industry. The effect of what we do today will have profound effects on small businesses and large businesses across the state of California. We've talked today about subversion of the process of reassessing by burying ownerships in trusts and the like, and we've talked about the issues of long-term ownership. I will tell you, having been in the business now since 1976, that we have no more interest in subversion than you do. I like a level playing field. I like seeing my competitors paying the same rate of taxes that I do. I like seeing my tenants paying the same rate of taxes that others do. So we support efforts towards a level playing field. But this whole conversation today about green acres, I thought Richard Moon's analysis was fascinating, but it doesn't work that way. Did you notice in his conversation he never once talked about how most property is financed, and when these ownership shares start turning, those loans go into default? There are due and sale clauses in loans on financed real estate. Most commercial real estate in the United States is financed. These sorts of subversive tactics, I don't deny that they happen, but it's an incrementally small fraction of the total number of transactions out there. Why? Because the insurance companies and the pension funds and the banks that we deal with are bright enough to watch what's going on. They want to know who their borrowers are. It just doesn't work that way. There were some other things that were said today. Mr. Thornburg talked about volatility, commercial versus residential, and I think we need, again, to draw a clear distinction in commercial real estate between that which is owner-occupied, those few buildings like Intel and Google own, versus what is traditional and institutional capital structure. And if you go talk to institutional investors, pension fund managers, go talk to Wall Street, their typical scenario is we want to be in a deal for 7 to 10 years and then we want to be out. Most commercial real estate today is owned on a 7 to 10 year investment cycle because most capital comes from a source that says, I want to be in and I want to be out. It has not always been that way. This is one of the consequences of the Tax Reform Act of '86. It has pushed us to Wall Street, but Wall Street now regulates and requires a turnover. So I just want to leave you with a few impressions. Contrary to the image that some have said today, we in my business don't spend hours trying to subvert or misreport the purchase of properties. There are too many other controls and constraints. My partners don't allow it. My lenders don't allow it. For the most part, it just does not happen. Lenders are all the more cautious now after the experience of the last 5 years than they were before that, if you can find one to talk to. I don't know how many have ever bought or sold commercial property. It's time-consuming, it's tedious, this notion of swapping tainted shares around. For property tax relief, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't worth it. There were a few other comments that I'll respond to, and then I'll finish. I've done business with Hilton. Most Hilton hotels are not owned by Hilton. Most Hilton hotels are franchised. The reason that most Hilton hotels are owned in apparent LLCs and corporate structures is that they're owned by people like Larkspur Hospitality out of the Bay Area, which owns a string of Hilton Gardens Inns. Hilton doesn't own their own hotels. They simply franchise their name. Toys R Us does not own their stores. They're a great tenant. Well, there was a time that they weren't such a great tenant. We didn't think that they would survive. But Toys R Us does not own their distribution centers. They don't own their stores. They're tenants. They're tenants of people like Vornado and Kimco and Regency. They don't own their stores. So if the company sells, the property does not reassess because they're just a tenant. Mr. Dorr spoke to the valuation of ground leases. I have several right now. I have a property that I've ground leased from the city of Monterey. I have another one that I've ground leased from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm doing another one now in downtown Monterey with a third and fourth generation trust fund baby. The patriarchs are gone. They're dead. But he correctly stated it. In each of those instances, I get the property tax bill. In each of those instances, again, these are net leases. I'm paying the property taxes. I'm paying the property tax on the land valuation. I'm paying the property tax on the building valuation. As a result, it really doesn't matter to me if the assessor has a low valuation on the land and a high valuation on the buildings, or a more moderate distribution of the two values. It's done on a unit basis, and I have all the taxes. So the family that we're leasing from has no particular advantage to their low tax basis because I get the bill anyway. Of course, City of Monterey pays no taxes, but I pay a proprietary interest tax, which is the same as a property tax, as though the property were privately held and taxed. It all comes to the bottom line. Finally, there's no longer a simple definition for commercial real estate, and those of you in this building have done a great job of helping us get there. In an age of sustainability, in an age of new urbanist philosophy, in most of our buildings, retail on the ground floor, we're now planning apartments above. Is that commercial or is that residential? You must be very careful in deliberating, differentiating between commercial and residential properties, because those lines are fading, and we're doing it intentionally, and we're doing it in a hurry. And finally, I want to assure you that our business is all about a healthy California and a healthy consumer. The commercial real estate industry is as interested in the financial well-being and the fiscal well-being of the state as anybody. We recognize that there's a problem. We're delighted to be at the table. We hope to stay at the table as the part of the dialogue. And anytime you want to talk to a layman who's in the business, CBPA will be happy to provide one. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Now we'll turn to questions from the committee, and first we have Mr. Nastandi.
Actually, he just kind of answered my question for Mr. Goldberg, which is about the Hilton's hotels, and it sounds like that's kind of what I thought. Most of these places are tenants of buildings, so they wouldn't have changed ownership.
If
a trust owns it,
I think he made precisely my point, that the ownership of property is extremely complex. Just start with that, and I think the financing of property. As he mentioned, there are a number of partners in any operation. So some partners come and some partners go. Should we be counting that and counting their ownership shares as a means of assessing property? I think it gets back to the ships in the night. I read very carefully through Blackstone's website and their video, and they say we are the only private equity firm that is balanced because we also have commercial real estate, and then went on to explain the value of their investment in real estate ownership, but they don't really own it. They lease the land. So when we look at the Beverly Wilshire,
right?
You find that there is somebody. There's a. Go ahead,
Mr. Goldberg. I got your point, and you. So I think my point is, and their point, they're allowed to own that land and lease it to people. So I don't know why you would want to come into their company and try and
here's
the ownership.
Here's the question.
Who's ever inside that corporation, it owns that property and it leases it.
When does that's why our system is so irrational, because you can have explicit changes of ownership all the time.
Okay.
And in some cases, see, here's the problem. In some cases, those Hilton hotels have been reassessed. In other cases, they have not been. Why should the property tax and the property value be connected to complicated financial arrangements? I did not hear word one from Dave Dorr or from Doug Mealy that said, yes, we can defend this system because these complicated arrangements are easy to track, are connected to what we should pay on the property. So why should some Hiltons be reassessed? Because of a financial structure that allows the assessor to look at those, and others to stay at 1975 values in Beverly Hills, which is what we found.
Because the entity didn't change then, that's why.
It's because, but ask whether or not the property, I think go to a prior question. Should the property tax be based on...
Mr. Goldberg, Mr. Nastandi has the floor.
If you don't mind, can you explain a little bit more about the UC Davis study? About how I was interested, if you took all of the houses, explain that.
What he did was he checked the property values of a sampling, obviously, of properties in Los Angeles County. He got cooperation from the Franchise Tax Board to check their income tax, and you see how much more they would pay in property tax if they were assessed to full value. Compared that with their income tax filings. And it came out that in a fairly consistent scale, the people with lower reported taxable income were going to pay a larger share of the property tax on a revenue neutral basis than those with had reported higher incomes. And I suspect, and most of us after talking to them, and we talked extensively, it has to do with the fact that low income seniors are staying put. And they're low income, so it's kind of, yeah, that sounds like a logical conclusion. So, but that was a study done by his team from UC Davis.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Harkey.
I think, Mr. Is it
Wheeler.
Wheel? I
Wheeler.
believe you have a
Well, if we
comment.
were good Germans, it'd be Vila, but we're not anymore. So, it occurs to me that the term franchise is another word that's not well understood. We should bring my friend Carl Hoagland in, who owns a number of hotels. Some of them are Hilton Garden Inns. Some of them are Larkspur Hospitality. He owns a number of different brands. Real property taxes tax ownership. But the brand on the building has nothing to do with ownership. It might be a Hilton today, and it might be a Hyatt tomorrow, and it might be an Independent the next day. One can change the brand of a hotel without changing the ownership of the real estate or any change in structure of the ownership of the LLC. It's a label. And most Hilton hotels are simply labels on the door. And for that franchise operator, Hilton will come and say, look, I want this sort of bedding, I want this sort of lighting, I want this sort of elevator, I want this sort of breakfast served. And tomorrow when it becomes a Marriott, it's different bedding, it's different lighting, it's different breakfast served. It's
Right,
still the
there's
same
a
building. It's just a franchise.
A different caliber or different mindset with each kind of group. And
So, of course, there's
I
no
understand that.
surprise that there's no change in assessment when the brand changes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we have a problem with understanding investors versus landowners. Blackstone invests, I believe. I mean, they're a huge investor, multiple avenues of investment. And I also was very, very pleased to hear about the triple net lease. Unless you're familiar with real estate, you don't understand that. And when you lease or when you go into a property, if you're setting up shop somewhere, you sign what's a triple net lease, and you pay for the expenses, the taxes, and the utilities thereof. That's just standard. And so I don't see how this is going to help California businesses. So I made this point just last year, and I'll make it again. These arguments are not new. These just come back again and again. I'm sure that if I were to stay here 20 years, I'd hear it every year. I do have something for Ms. Bester. Basic aid school district. Okay, I'm in a basic aid school district. Do you like that?
Do I like that?
Right. Do you know that there are a lot of school districts that are not basic aid?
Yes, I'm aware that there are 125 basic aid districts
the state
in California.
backfills? And see, that's
The
what
other
I was-
districts, yes, and I'm well aware of how, for instance, in San Mateo County, 60% of our students are attending basic aid schools, 40% are not. That ERAF, which is generated from our property taxes, funds the non-basic aid schools, the revenue limit schools, and also our vehicle license fee. I could take you through all this. I totally
Yeah,
understand that.
I understand,
So-
but my question to you was, see, this is how I started this out. That every time we talk about Prop 13, for some reason we get into education funding,
Yeah.
and education funding is a maze, and I think it's that way on purpose. But the basic aid school concept needs to be relooked. I mean, none of us mind paying what we call our fair share. If, in fact, we get our fair share, we don't get our fair share. And you know, if you're in a basic aid district, that you do not, that you can raise your property taxes and they will be distributed everywhere else. And I think that's a big difference between what happens in Texas and what happens in California, is that you can see the effects of the dollars you're paying right there in your school district, in your neighborhood, for your utilities, for whatever. In California, it gets spread out statewide, and you don't see satisfaction with what you're paying.
Except in basic aid districts.
Well, not really. Not really. Because basic aid districts only mean that you get a little extra, you get the basic minimum, or that your property taxes actually meet the minimum that the school that the state has determined that every school should meet. But if you check around and you see what other schools are getting, they're getting backfill also on top of that. So you're not getting any backfill from the state, from the big Prop 98 pie in the sky, but you are getting, and so this is the whole problem. We all pay for education to Prop 98, but people that are districts that are created after all of this funding took place are not getting anything or very little out of this Prop 98 pie. And so I'm all for education funding, but I think we need to look at it such that we kind of look at the basic aid concept, we look at the equalization, we go back to the drawing board in education if we were going to tie property taxes to education, because I can tell you my property taxes can continue to go up, my education, my monies at my schools will not, it will be sucked in to the big state pie, because our the way that it's set was back, I think, in the 1970s or whatnot, where if you were paying so much to education out of your property tax, which Orange County was, that same amount stayed for education. But by the same token, if your counties weren't really big and established, like right now, Orange County gets, I think, 11% out of every property tax dollar goes to the county, and a huge amount goes to education, which is why we're basic aid. And so you take someplace like San Francisco, Los Angeles, areas that were established, they get a lot of backfill from the
Not San Francisco. Not San Francisco.
Pie.
No.
Oh,
It's filled by ERAF.
Yeah, well,
Los Angeles, absolutely. You and I could have a feast day on allocation and that. I mean, I'm sorry that Assembly Member Gordon left, because I whispered allocation into his ear at his last, at home or whatever they have. But that's not what this meeting is about.
No, but this meeting is always about raising property taxes on somebody to pay for education, and I understand that, but it just doesn't go to education statewide. It goes to the state pot. So that's why I asked you my question about, do you like the basic aid concept?
I like the concept of property taxes funding the local services that we touch every day. I like that, because then people understand that taxes are not evil. They're not sin taxes. They are.
If we can wrap this
I
up.
understand, and you did say that. What I'm trying.
Could I talk about triple net?
Well,
no. The point I'm trying to make is that you're not getting what you're paying for.
And we need to kind of circle back onto topic, please. And we are wrapping up. This is our last panel here. Mr. Yamiano, do you want any parting words here?
Yeah, I wanted to refocus, if I could, if there aren't any more questions. And that is, thank you for the discussion. It is very dynamic. And the reason that the questions have been asked all these years is because we haven't really provided an answer. And I'm not going to get into the blame game about legislatures or governors or commercial property owners or chief consultants to this committee. There's been a lot of parsing of issues. There's been a lot of sophisticated terms. A little bit, it's like, how do you interpret something that is so technical if you don't have the background? Who has the upper hand here? What I think we are missing is this issue isn't going to go away. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than everyone at this table and this committee. It has taken on a populist tinge. Ironically, I think Prop 13 was a populist issue in the 70s. We don't live in the 70s anymore. There are still constants. Absolutely, there are still constants. But there is a general unrest. There is a general questioning from every political stripe, from every class background that has been articulated to me. And we tend to be in a bubble here in Sacramento, but I hear a lot of questionings. I hear a lot of anger, and I hear a lot of frustration. With all due respect, I cannot defend the status quo. Seeing it as I see it, if we're in stasis about this, if we're going to throw complicated terms about this, if we're going to say there's a difference in the taxes going to the tenants as opposed to we're forgetting the one thing here, which is called profit. How is that profit distributed? Who does it go to? We have a lot of work here, and what I'd like to do is I've introduced a bill that would continue this conversation with the stakeholders, some of you right here at the table, because we do need reform, we do need change. We can get bogged down in many discussions and get very particular, but But that's really not my goal. My goal is to address the reform that I feel is needed in and around how we tax property, whether it's commercial or residential, and we can't neglect it any longer. And as I say, it's a bigger issue here than the people in the room, and it really deserves our attention. And I want to thank you, Chair, and Madam Vice Chair, for the opportunity to do this, and I look forward to further discussions.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to the panel. I appreciate your time and attention to this issue. Next, we will turn to public comments, and I only have one request at this time, and that's David Wolf with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And if there are more for public testimony, please come up and.
You have a time limit, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, we're going to try to keep it to about 3 minutes.
I'm not going to go on forever.
So, Mr. Wolf, we're all yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Thank you. David Wolf here with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and I wasn't going to speak today, but then the committee and some of the witnesses decided to go after homeowners and Prop 13 for homeowners, the very same system that has saved homeowners $550 billion over 33 years. Let me start with a story. And this is a story that took place very common before 1978. It was very common before 78. There were homeowners, members, who had paid off their homes. They had paid off their mortgages, and yet they were getting foreclosed on their properties because they couldn't pay the property tax. Because property tax was going up not 2% a year, but 3, 4, 5, 6% a year. That's the value of Prop 13. That's the value of protecting the American dream. And that's worth hanging on to, especially in the middle of the worst recession in 70 years. Members, let me talk about the "that's not fair" argument, or the man behind the tree, or whatever you want to call it. There was a United States Supreme Court case in 1992, Nordlinger versus Hahn. And by a 7, I think it was an 8-to-1 margin, actually, including Justices Kennedy and Souter supporting it, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Nordlinger versus Hahn that the assessment value system established by Prop 13 was inherently fair. And let me tell you why. Prop 13 caps your property taxes at 1% of the price at which you bought your home, and then increases it by no more than 2% a year. You know 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years down the line precisely what you're going to be paying in property taxes because of Prop 13's 1% cap. And might I add, for local government dissenters out there, that local government also has that same stability. They know precisely within reason how much money they're going to be receiving in property taxes every year, within reason. And that's a big deal when property and sales taxes consume about 70% of local government funds. 70% of that revenue comes from property and sales taxes. Can you imagine, members, what it would be like for local governments in a market valuation system, not Prop 13's assessed valuation model? You would have property taxes declining in the middle of the recession in 2007, 2008 by double digits, and they still would not have come back by now. They still would not have come back. You want to talk about bankruptcy. You want to talk about scary local government financing. You want to talk about Stockton and Vallejo occurring all over this state. Get rid of Prop 13. Get rid of it. Let me just make some closing comments. I know my time is short.
Sure.
People are like, in California, okay, we must have some of the lowest property tax rates in the state or in the country. We don't. According to the Tax Foundation, a nonprofit think tank out of Washington, D.C., we are 14th in per capita property taxes. Now, a lot of that has to do with the bonds and parcel taxes and special taxes voters have approved, but even so, we're 14th in per capita property taxes. We would argue we need more relief for homeowners. We need an increase in the property tax exemption. The comment was brought up about property tax relief and saying, well, if we just provided relief for seniors, There might be a way out or a way to gut out Proposition 13. And let me just close with this. We had relief for seniors, members. We had relief for seniors. There was a program called the Property Tax Postponement Program. Okay? And that program was actually very unique. It allowed you to postpone payment on your property taxes in exchange for the government placing a lien against your house. And then when you either sold or moved, the government would have first call on collecting that back property tax revenue plus simple interest. It worked great for tens of thousands of homeowners in the decades that it had been implemented. And what happened to it? The majority party members got rid of the program 3 years ago because they couldn't afford what ultimately amounted to a $15 million program to keep tens of thousands of seniors in their homes. And members, you can bring it back. You own the budget in Prop 25. You can bring it back. And we would definitely encourage that. If you want relief for homeowners, members, and I'll close with this, Proposition 60 allows you to transfer the base within the county that you live.
If you could wrap up.
If you want relief for homeowners across the state, and Mr. Perea, thank you for giving me additional time, simply this: allow individuals to transfer the base to properties in different counties. Let's explore that. Let's look at that. If we really want to provide relief for seniors, there are ways to go about doing this and strengthening Prop 13. Thank you.
Thank you. And can you state your name and title for the record?
Yes, my name is Haley Corliss, and I'm a researcher born and raised in California. I also wasn't planning on speaking today, but I felt compelled to write up a short testimony. So I've had the opportunities, a couple opportunities, to work on commercial property tax research over the last few years. And I have witnessed extreme inequalities among commercial properties in Sacramento County, San Francisco County, Los Angeles County, and other counties across California, some of which you heard about today. I'm convinced, because of this and some other recent experiences, that the property tax system in the state is flawed, and a resource for revenue remains untapped. I'm a researcher for an employees union for public and private service employees out of the Bay Area. And much of my time is spent analyzing the finances and budgets of our counties, cities, public service agencies, and schools. And I find that in several of our cities, counties, schools, public service providers, they're underfunded, sometimes severely, and often due to an inadequate level of property tax revenue. In addition, after moving to San Francisco from Sacramento last fall, about the time that the Occupy movement erupted, I have witnessed a number of protests and rallies led by public activists and community groups that seek to educate the public of the inequalities of our tax system, property and other, and to bring light to the fact that these tax inequalities, loopholes, and tax breaks are taken huge advantage of by the largest banks, corporations, and private equity firms in not only our state but our country. And these affect pretty directly the state of our county, cities, schools, and public services. So these recent personal experiences of mine have brought me here today to urge your consideration of, if not support, then just consideration of reform of our property tax system, particularly focusing on commercial property, and to support Assemblymember Amiano's bill for further discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Is there any other public testimony? See none, that will conclude this hearing. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much.